It's good to have my friend Jim Tomberlin with us today. Jim, welcome. How are you doing?
Doing well. It's always good to be talking with you, Tony, and staying warm here in cold Colorado today.
Well, it's good to have you with us. For those of you that don't know Jim, he's really one of the fathers of Multisite, going back to your days in actually the church in Colorado, wasn't it, Jim?
Yes, my church, Woodman Valley Chapel, is where my journey with Multisite Church began back in the mid-90s.
Yeah, and then on to Willow, and now full-time helping churches with multi-site and mergers. And so, Jim, I wanted to invite you to the conversation today because I'm beginning to see some trends, hearing stories about more churches who are trying to launch multi-site, but in some way doing it unsuccessfully because I'm hearing more stories of multi-site locations that are being shut down. Is this something we should be concerned about?
Well, I would say concerned, yes. Worried, no. The multi-site movement has dramatically grown. The last year, we're now reporting over 5,000 multi-site churches across the country. And we're seeing more churches join this movement, clearly. But with that, when you start to see this amount of churches, you're going to begin to see some who are failing at it or they're not doing it well. And but so it's to be expected that we would start to see some that are not coming off as well as they should. But it's a natural development. A new idea begins to get mainstreamed.
Well, and as you're looking at situations like this where multi-site isn't working, do you see any common themes that are playing out?
Well, yeah, I think several. First of all, many have gotten on the multi-site bandwagon for the wrong reason. And I think the first important question, and you've commented on this in the past, the first question is, why are we doing this? Or why should we do this? And for many, they've gotten on this bandwagon because everybody else is doing it. That's never a good reason. Or to maybe turn around a church that's stuck, or to fix a church. But those are all very weak reasons to multi-site. But the reason why church and multi-site is because they become convinced that this is the best strategy for us to fulfill the mission of our church. And, the best of multi-siting is we are reproducing who we are. And so if you're not a healthy church, you're not ready to multi-site.
I'm assuming one of the key issues that churches are bumping up against is just the quality of leadership that they're using at these locations. And having heard you talk in the past, I know the capacity of leadership and specifically the campus pastor is critical to the success of multi-site. So for those churches that are considering taking this next step, when they're identifying a future campus pastor, what are some of the attributes you would encourage them to look for?
Well, you're right on. I just on the phone with a church today in Virginia that's having a conversation who's thinking about going multi-site. And what I tell churches that the most difficult decision going multi-site is finding the right facility. But the most important decision in going multi-site is appointing the right campus pastor to lead that location, that congregation. And so when we surveyed multi-site churches in the past, with Leadership Network has done 3 different surveys over the last 5-7 years, and we have another one coming out next year, by the way. But we asked the question, what was your biggest mistake going multi-site? And it was underestimating the importance of the campus pastor. And these churches told us the 2 most important characteristics of a campus pastor is, first of all, they needed to be a high-capacity leader, a leader that people would follow and who could turn those followers into volunteers and into teams, but also that this was a leader who could follow the leader. That is a campus pastor who was a strong leader at his location, but also was a team player, a follower of the senior leader of the church and the senior team. But second characteristic, that they needed to possess the DNA of the church. That is, when you cut them, they can't help themselves. They bleed the church that is launching and sending them. Tony, I want to go back to answer your first question. What are the common themes of churches where multi-site's not working? First, I commented about they go multi-siting for the wrong reasons instead of the lack of a compelling reason, a lot of the wrong reason. But often they launch too close or too far when they do launch, or they launch with too few too soon. And I'm increasingly discovering that a lot of churches are confusing multi-siting with church planting. Mm. And they're different animals, same outcome at the end of the day, a new church in a community that didn't have that church before. But they do have a different pathway and trajectory of how they unfold. And the last reason why church multi-site campuses are often not working is the one we just ended, the question we ended on. They launch with the wrong campus pastor. Yeah. Everything rises or falls on leadership, as we've known.
I think you raise an interesting question, though, as it relates to multi-site versus church planting. Can you give us some distinctives that you think, churches really need to be aware of this if they're wanting to be a reproducing church? I think there are certain aspects of the strategy that are more conducive to multi-site, and others really need to be looking at more of a church planting approach. Both can work, but they are very distinctive.
Absolutely, and I'm a big advocate for both. To me, it's not an either or; it's a both and. We need both, and there's not one that's better than the other. But there are certain circumstances that are better for a multi-site campus versus a church plant, and vice versa. And so, to me, it's all about being a reproducing church, and these are two different ways to reproduce a church. But one of the things that we know from multi-site church world is that the majority of multi-site campuses are within a 30-minute driving time of the sending campus. We know that 40% of all multi-site campuses are within 15 minutes of the sending campus driving time, and that 48% are between 15 and 30 minutes. So 88% of all multi-site campuses are within 30 minutes max. Mm-hmm. And so what's the difference between a church plant and a multi-site campus? 30 minutes mm-hmm. is one of the differences. Because the premise of multi-siting is that we launch campuses. We're not going to these little communities. We're already there. Our people already live there. And this is why we have a high success rate, a 90% success rate of multi-site campuses. Because we start day one with a strong core of people who have your DNA and who love your church and who are already present in the community. Where church plants typically go where you have to go and build a core from scratch. And that takes longer and harder and it's more difficult. Which is better? Both are better. We need both. But the multi-site model maximizes where you already have presence in your community. A typical church planter has a strong leadership gift and a teaching gift if they're going to be successful, and they would rather lead their own team and do most of the teaching and preaching. And if you're wired that way, you ought to be a church planter. But a good multi-site campus pastor is someone who would rather be on a winning team than be the senior leader of the whole team. Now they need to be a strong leader, no doubt, but they have a desire to rather play on a winning team under an even stronger leader than to be the head guy and doing most of the preaching and determining the philosophy of the church.
Yeah, I think we're seeing, and this is one of the unfortunate aspects of blogging and social media, is we hear the stories of the few churches that have the resources and capacity to leverage multi-site in distant communities, states even, but those are the rare exception, aren't they, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. I think one of, and you actually talked about this a moment ago. I think one of the reasons why some churches aren't getting traction with multi-site is because they're launching too soon, and so maybe it would help folks if they heard from you. What are some of the key things that churches need to be watching for as kind of like benchmarks before they're really in a position to be able to move forward with multi-site?
Great question. I like to recommend to churches what I call the 10% rule. When are we ready to launch a campus? When you can launch 10% of your people out from your location, from the sitting campus, and that 10% be a large enough number of people to be a viable congregation immediately, and that 10% doesn't devastate the sending campus in terms of people and resources. And so we know the average launch core size of a church in multi-site world is 75 people, and that would kind of be congruent with what we are recommending a church. What we're seeing that the average church that goes multi-site now is 850 people, and so 10% of that would be 75 people. I like to recommend not launching a campus until you're at least 1,000 in attendance strong. Instead of, but I've had churches that call me and write me, we're 200 and thinking about launching going multi-site, and I say, great. When you get to 500, call me. It's good, and then when you get to 1,000, you're ready. If you know that multi-site's in your future, if you can break past a few hundred, get in the 500 range. Now's the time for us to really sit down and talk about laying out a strategy that will set you up for a multi-site future. Instead of if you know multi-sites in your future, it will determine how your strategy on facilities, how big of facilities or buildings you should build or land you should buy. It'll determine your technology that you want to incorporate into your facilities, and it'll determine your staff hires if you know that multi-site is in your future. And you can begin doing all that way before you get to launching your first campus, but you can lay the groundwork for that.
Yeah, and in addition to that, Jim, I would think clarifying vision, developing systems and strategies that can be replicated at multiple locations, specifically leadership development. There's so much that you can do today if you really do think multi-site's going to be a part of your future.
Absolutely. I talk about you got to be healthy. What does it mean to be a healthy church? It means you have your leadership is unified around the mission and vision of the church, and both your staff and your lay leadership. And secondly, you have good system. You've been able to put systems in place that can be reproducible. And this is where smaller churches are still developing that. But that's the foundation before you start launching campuses. And you've got to be at least 500 plus, I think, before you begin seriously thinking about we are now in that capability of reproducing ourselves. I like to use this little phrase: the bigger the baby in the womb, the healthier the birth. And so the most important decision, as we've talked about in launching campuses, is the multi-site campus pass. The most difficult decision issue is finding the facility. But after that, the most strategic decision is to launch with as strong of core people as possible. And so, the bigger you are at home base, with multiple services, video venues, growing that base as strong as you can, as large as you can, and then launching from that, the healthier that new campus will be.
Well, very good. Jim, before we let you go, I know in the last year or so you've been doing quite a bit of work on mergers. Two churches merging together to become one. Can you give us an update on how that's progressing?
Well, weekly now I get calls and requests with churches who are considering the merger option. And as you mentioned, my co-author Warren Byrne and I wrote a book, Better Together: Making Church Mergers Work. Came out this April this year. And we've seen a great response to that, a great interest in that. There's a new kind of merger today that's more mission-driven. What can we do? How can we have a better future together than it is than the old mergers of the past, which were more survival-driven and more about preserving the past? And so, every multi-siting growing church in America today is seeing increasingly that mergers is an option. But it's a fast-track way to multi-site when it's right. It can be a huge diversion of time and energy and money when it's not right. That's why we try to write a book to help churches to quickly discern, is this right for us? But clearly, this is changing the landscape across the country. We know about 80% of the churches across the nation have plateaued, dead, or dying. And most of them have facilities in desperate need of a vibrant ministry. And then we have 20% of the churches in America today are growing and vibrant and dynamic and often in desperate need of space. And so there's a huge win-win there when church leaders can kind of set aside their logos and egos and say, what's the best for the kingdom in our community that we share together? How could our churches be better together? How could our community be better together? And could the kingdom of God be extended together better than separate? And so a lot of churches are asking those questions, and we're seeing a lot of realignment and of churches along this way. By the way, along that trend with that too, Tony, is seeing a huge increase of changing of church names. You've been seeing this?
Yes.
but yeah, clearly the merger option is another tool that is sort of being set back on the table, but it's a different kind of tool than the mergers of the past.
That's great. Well, Jim, if there are churches out there who have questions either about multi-site or mergers, how can we connect them with you?
Well, just my website's the best way at multisitesolutions.com. All one word, multisitesolutions.com. Follow me on Twitter, Multisite Guy, or a Merger Guru, and we'd love to be helpful. Have a team of associates around the country now that are practitioners, doers who are doing it, and love to help other churches as well. So if we could be helpful, give us a call.
Very good. All right, Jim, thank you for your time today. We really appreciate you.
And Tony, thank you for your contribution to the body of Christ and giving leadership and help to churches all across the nation as well. It's an honor to be with you today.
Very
Blessings.
good.
Merry Christmas.